Gene Chambers is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Reno, Nevada. She received her Master's of Science degree from Utah State in range science and a PhD in ecology also from Utah State. She joined the Rocky Mountain Research Station in 1983. Her research focuses primarily on disturbance and restoration ecology, primarily in the Great Basin, global change processes, invasive species, and semi-arid watersheds and ecosystems. Her talk today has a co-author. Dr. Jim Grace is with the USGS in Lafayette, Louisiana, and holds adjunct professorship in biology at the University of Louisiana. So with that, please welcome Dr. Chambers.
Good morning. I'm going to be focusing, along with Jim, on understanding resistance to invasion and resilience to disturbance, and asking a question if this isn't really one of our keys to restoring Great Basin ecosystems. The importance of ecological resistance and resilience has been widely recognized by restoration ecologists for quite some time. We're seeing more commonly that applied ecologists in general are starting to focus on these concepts when they talk about both managing and restoring ecosystems. An increased understanding of both resistance and resilience can help us in terms of prioritizing land treatments as well as going forward with active restoration. Whoops, there we go. What exactly are we talking about when we say ecological resistance and resilience? Well, resistance is really the ability of an ecosystem to maintain characteristic processes despite various natural and anthropogenic stressors or disturbances, including things like periodic drought or occasional overgrazing by livestock. Resistance to invasives, as we're all well aware, is particularly important in Great Basin ecosystems. It is the biotic and abiotic factors and ecological processes in an ecosystem that limit the population growth of a particular invading species. What about resilience? It really determines the recovery potential of an ecosystem. It's the capacity of an ecosystem to regain characteristic processes over time following those stresses or disturbance. And I've included a photograph of an area that was restored using a prescribed burn to indicate that we're not only talking about natural and anthropogenic disturbances, but also land management treatments. Thresholds are a related and very important concept. They define the boundaries between ecological states, and we can basically recognize them when an ecosystem does not return to its original condition via natural processes. This is particularly important for restoration ecologists because it often defines those ecological conditions beyond which a system is not going to recover without active restoration. I put in this simple graphic just to emphasize that Great Basin ecosystems are comprised of a diverse group of vegetation types and that they have inherent differences in terms of both their resistance and resilience. Basically, we're looking at the types of elevational gradients that Bob Nowak talked about. This really illustrates that we're looking at significant differences in effective precipitation as well as net productivity over those gradients. Our systems, as we're well aware, range from more arid areas all the way down to 4 inches of precipitation, characterized by salt desert shrub and other vegetation types, moving into sagebrush ecosystems and woodland and sagebrush combined at mid-precipitation, and then a scattering of forested ecosystems and even alpine at some of our higher elevations. Two of our major issues within these ecosystems are invasion of cheatgrass within our sagebrush and now more mesic salt desert shrub ecosystems, and expansion of woodlands into our upper elevation, mid to upper elevation sagebrush ecosystems. And we're really going to use these two issues to emphasize how resistance and resilience can be used in a restoration and management context. If we look specifically at expansion of pinyon and juniper species into sagebrush ecosystems, we can see that they can affect these ecosystems in several different ways. Progressive expansion of trees and then maturation of stands can result in a decrease in the understory species and also a progressive increase in the fuel loads in these ecosystems. This places these ecosystems at risk of more severe burns that burn over larger areas, and in those areas where we have depleted understories and we have seed sources, they are at risk of crossing ecological thresholds and conversion to cheatgrass, especially in our lower elevation woodlands. Now, we can use our understanding of resistance and resilience in these ecosystems to obtain more sustainable ecosystems. Logical goals for these ecosystems are maintaining a desirable proportion and configuration of both sagebrush and pinyon and juniper on the landscape. They also include increasing the herbaceous perennial component in these ecosystems and decreasing the risk of cheatgrass invasion and the invasion of other undesirable non-native invaders. With this understanding of resistance and resilience, we can select effective restoration or management treatments that can help us in terms of achieving these goals. These can be things like prescribed fire, like you're seeing here, or mechanical treatments. And ultimately, our objective is to obtain those sustainable ecosystems. Now, this graph shows the resistance of our Great Basin sagebrush ecosystems to both woodland expansion and to cheatgrass. And basically what you're looking at is the relative resistance as a function of the different vegetation types and the environmental conditions over which they occur. It shows that at the most basic level, resistance to invasion is really a function of the ecological amplitudes of the particular species. In other words, whether or not they can establish and persist under a given set of environmental conditions. We would expect that resistance would be higher in more stressful environments. Our dry salt desert shrub communities, our upper elevation mountain brush communities, because there's only a limited suite of species that can actually survive and persist under those types of environmental conditions. In terms of cheatgrass, we're all aware that historically our Wyoming sagebrush ecosystems have been the least resistant to this particular species, but that we're seeing increasing movement of this species into some of our salt desert shrub communities. Resistance to tree expansion is greater for our mountain sage communities and then also mountain brush. If we look at resilience, we can state that in general, resilience increases over gradients of available resources and net productivity. Greater productivity and functionally diverse plant communities have higher resilience or greater recovery potential following disturbance. They typically exhibit less resource fluctuations in terms of precipitation, especially. They have an increased capacity to compete with invaders because of greater plant cover and biomass. And if we look at, say, a comparison of a mountain sage community and a Wyoming sage community, we often see more rapid recovery after disturbance and an increased ability to resist invasion. Now, within any given vegetation type, there are additional factors that we have to consider because they significantly influence both resistance and resilience. And Jim likes to talk about the ecological memory of these systems. In management terms, this includes things like the site potential, as indicated by the soils and precipitation of a given area. It includes species composition of an area, ecological conditions as indicated by the native seed banks and seed sources, and certainly the residual plants and animals on those particular areas. It also includes the presence, abundance, and type of invasive species on a particular area. We can't ignore severity and frequency of disturbance, inappropriate livestock grazing, high-intensity fires, and fire return intervals that are less than the historic fire interval certainly decrease the resistance and resilience of these particular systems. Interactions among invasive species and disturbance regimes also are critical in terms of considering resistance and resilience. And a good example of this is the annual grass fire cycle. Now, we can use our research in Great Basin ecosystems that has looked at the factors that affect invasion of cheatgrass and also expansion of woodlands to essentially illustrate some of these concepts for our Great Basin ecosystems. This essentially shows you the results of a Joint Fire Sciences Program demonstration area that looked at the effects of prescribed fire on pinyon and juniper woodlands. What you're seeing here is the mean biomass of the herbaceous species, which are critical to the recovery of these systems 3 years after a prescribed fire, and these data were collected over an elevational gradient that included Wyoming sage, and mountain brush, and it's important to point out that these systems had an intermediate level of tree cover at the time of burning, approximately 30 to 40%. And there are a couple of things I want you to notice here. One is that prior to burning, the control sites in the Wyoming sage had considerably less perennial herbaceous mass than those on the control sites on the mountain brush sites. This is just another indicator that we have greater net productivity and greater capacity to support these herbaceous perennials and other species at higher elevations in these ecosystems. Following burning, we saw a fairly significant recovery in the Wyoming sage community. However, if we look at the mountain brush community, we see that even 3 years after the burn, the mountain brush community still had approximately 2 to 3 times more herbaceous biomass than that Wyoming sage community. The greater biomass, the greater abundance of species, and greater productivity on these sites can increase resilience to subsequent disturbance, such as overgrazing by livestock, can increase resistance to non-native invaders. This is data from the same study. Essentially what you're looking at here is the mean biomass of the herbaceous species, but this time we're looking at specifically the mountain brush community and a gradient of tree cover. Tree cover here goes from 12% to 38% to 74%. And what I want you to notice here is that if we look first at the control sites, we see, as we predicted, a progressive decrease in terms of the herbaceous perennial cover as we have an increase in tree cover on these particular sites. If we look at recovery of these sites 3 years after the burn, we see that on the low tree cover site, we have approximately a 6-fold greater amount of biomass than we do on the site with the high tree cover. In addition, if we look at post-burn, we see that we have a lower amount of the annual species on the low tree cover site than we do on the high tree cover site. This suggests that these sites could be more susceptible to our annual invaders. In this particular case, we purposely selected sites with low abundance of annuals, so that wasn't a particular problem. This shows you the results of a companion study, and in this case we looked specifically at the effects of elevation, herbaceous species, and fire on cheatgrass establishment, growth, and production. And what you're looking at here is establishment as reflected in the number of plants at the end of the growing season. And interestingly, what we found is that establishment really wasn't affected by either the removal of herbaceous perennial species or by fire. However, germination and survival to the end of the growing season was, as we had indicated or predicted earlier, that significantly lower at higher elevations. Upper elevation ecosystems, fortunately within the Great Basin, still have significant ecophysiological constraints on the growth and reproduction of cheatgrass. What we did see in terms of establishment was that it was significantly affected by both site conditions and then also the amount of precipitation and the temperature regime during any particular growing season. So in terms of establishment, the characteristics of a particular site as well as the particular growing seasons make a significant difference. We see a very different result when we look at the growth and biomass of cheatgrass plants and the numbers of seeds that are produced for a given plant. And this is a pretty complex slide, so I'm going to step you through it. Essentially what we saw here were that the effects of both herbaceous removal and fire were highly significant and that they were additive. If we look at, first of all, just the control sites, what we see is that herbaceous perennial removal resulted in a 2 to 3-fold increase in terms of both the number of seeds per plant and biomass. If we look specifically at the effects of fire, comparing the control or not burn site to the burn site, we see a 3 to 6-fold increase in both the biomass and seed production. However, if we look at the combined effects of herbaceous species removal and burning, we have essentially a 10 to 30-fold increase in seed production and biomass. This is consistent across all of our sites and in 2 locations in the Great Basin, one in Utah and one in Nevada. What these data suggest strongly is that when we have perturbations, disturbances to the landscape, we do have significant increases in available resources, and this can increase, of course, the susceptibility of these systems to invasion. The other component that is pretty obvious here is that one of the things we really need to manage for are those perennial herbaceous species, because they significantly decrease the susceptibility to invasion. Now, I wanted to also scale up a bit and show you that some of the same factors exist at landscape scales. This is research conducted with Peter Weisberg and one of his graduate students. And basically, you're looking at a structural equation model here. What we did was to go in and look at a watershed scale burn and to look at both the abiotic and biotic factors that influenced cheatgrass cover 7 years after the burn. And what I want you to see here is that solar radiation, or again, temperature, strongly influences whether or not you have bromus tectorum on any particular portion on the landscape, and then that our perennial herbaceous cover has a significant negative influence. So those areas of the landscape that have that perennial herbaceous cover can help to depress cheatgrass. These are data from the same particular study, and what it shows here are landscape levels controls on Artemisia tridentata. And what we're looking at basically is that, as we predicted from our plot scale studies, pre-burn canopy cover has a negative effect on our Artemisia cover following the burn, while perennial herbaceous cover is positively associated with the mountain sage cover after the burn. And what this indicates here again is those areas on the landscape where we can maintain that perennial herbaceous cover functional diversity can help us in terms of both the fire behavior on these landscapes, as well as the persistence and reestablishment of sagebrush. Excuse me, Freudian slip. Okay, so we can put this all together with a conceptual model. And basically what this is meant to show you are those factors that we need to consider in terms of understanding resistance and resilience on the landscape and how they can be used essentially to affect our restoration objectives. They include, of course, the environmental conditions we've been talking about, the abiotic environment, in terms of both the topography and the soil water characteristics as well as the temperature characteristics, the ecological condition, the factors that affect them, such as the pinyon and juniper cover and age structure, other factors such as livestock grazing, how these all interact with one another. For example, our pinyon juniper cover, as we illustrated, affects sagebrush. It affects the perennial herbaceous cover, and it also affects treatment characteristics or disturbance characteristics, such as the size, shape, and intensity of the disturbance. Other disturbance characteristics or post-disturbance characteristics, of course, that are important is that post-treatment precipitation. So using our knowledge of these factors, how they interact with one another, we can better achieve those desirable restoration objectives. Now, given that one of our core management objectives is to maintain increased ecological resistance on the landscape, we can consider several different management steps. The first of these, as we already heard from Nat, is to assess environmental characteristics, vegetation types, and ecological conditions at landscape scales. I think we're all starting and trying to think about larger scales at this point in time. These are critical if we are to maintain key habitat areas like networks of sage-grouse leks, and also to effectively manage with respect to increasing pressures on the landscape from things like energy development. The second step really is to develop that understanding of ecological resistance and resilience and the relationship to thresholds for our particular systems. We already heard a little bit about Sage Step. You'll be able to look at this project in more detail with some of the poster sessions. And it essentially is one of our active efforts to try to increase this understanding. The third step is to prioritize management activities at landscape scales. This includes not only restoration and rehabilitation, but I think using restoration as a metaphor, protection and prevention. So what are we talking about for protection? Areas that require protection are those with inherently low resistance or resilience, like our lower elevation cold desert communities. They're areas of high conservation value, and they're also areas at risk of crossing ecological thresholds. In these particular areas, we need to focus on eliminating stressors like repeated fire and inappropriate livestock grazing, controlling surface disturbance and invasion corridors, and increasing efforts to detect and eradicate invasives. In terms of preventative management, we can use it to maintain or increase resistance and resilience in areas that have declining ecological conditions that are in the initial stages of cheatgrass invasion or tree expansion. I want to stress that in terms of all these different options, eliminating stressors is a high priority. When we are talking about preventative management, we can go in and do active treatment in areas with higher resilience. Objectives typically include increasing the herbaceous perennials through competitive release from shrubs and trees and reducing woody fuels to minimize risk of high severity fires. Treatments here include prescribed fire, mechanical shrub or tree thinning, or herbicides. Well, what about restoration or rehabilitation? This is actively going in and using control and revegetation. Typically, because these are more ecologically difficult and economically expensive, they are considered to be lower priority. Exceptions include post-burn areas, emergency stabilization and rehabilitation, seedings, for example, areas adjacent to intact vegetation communities that serve as buffers or fuel breaks, wildland-urban interface, and endangered ecosystems, including critical habitat for threatened and endangered species. Of course, we can use integrated management strategies that use both pre-treatments to reduce the invader, followed by revegetation to establish the desired plant communities. And we have a lot of discussion about the choice of seeded species within our revegetation projects. I'd just like to suggest that if we are restoring critical habitat, then we definitely need to be focusing on natives. When we're talking about creating fire breaks or green strips, natives or introduced species that are competitive and have low flammability are clearly the logical choice. I put this in, I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to just summarize what some of our alternatives in terms of both preventative management and active restoration are for these systems. When we have a woodland or shrubland ecosystem where we have a relatively intact understory and minimal cheatgrass, then we can use fire to increase the native forage component. With the lack of fire and overgrazing, we have the potential to move this system back to a woodland or shrubland dominated system. In the absence of fire or overgrazing, we can move these systems into a condition where we have a depleted understory and where we're starting to see an increase in cheatgrass. In terms of active management, fire usually is not a good option because we have the potential to drive those to a cheatgrass-dominated systems. Usually herbicides or mechanical treatments are our best option there. Once we have cheatgrass dominance on the landscape, we're clearly talking about active restoration and trying to move that system back to a shrub and perennial grass and forage-dominated community. Now, a few words, I guess, about the right road forward. I think for many of us restorationists, it seems a bit bumpy at times. Great Basin ecosystems are undergoing rapid, large-scale, and often undesirable changes. One of the things I hope I've stressed here is that in order to be effective at managing these ecosystems, we do need to conduct larger scale and more comprehensive analyses that cross administrative boundaries and address critical issues throughout the region. We can prioritize our restoration and management activities based upon ecological resistance and resilience, and we're continuing to learn a great deal about that. We need to anticipate future changes, climate, population growth, land use change, and energy development. These are all active issues that are going to continue to influence the Great Basin. We also heard a little bit about developing mechanisms for effective collaboration. I would say most of us are actively engaged in that. I think it's something we need to continue to pursue. And I might have time for a question.
Yes, we have time for.
I think it definitely depends on the system of interest, but actually that's one thing that I think Sage Step is going to contribute to and will help us to actually take that next step and provide more definitive information on what those are. So, for example, if we think about a gradient of ecological conditions, that is exactly what Sage Step is addressing. Hopefully what we will be able to look at specifically are the percentages of herbaceous perennial cover where you can actually anticipate recovery on these systems. We've already done that, I believe, for some of our systems, like our Joint Fire Sciences Program demonstration area, and hopefully that's the kind of information we can continually gather over time.
Take one more question.
Do you feel for some of the mechanisms as to why the invasibility, for example, changes based on some of these communities and species that are in this community? So, your resilience, goes up to invasibility based on the presence of herbaceous, cover in the sagebrush, for example. Do you have some feeling about what mechanisms are competition for resources?
Yeah, I think resource competition is critical, and I think it's resource fluctuations. Some work that I'm doing with Bruce Roundy actually shows that when you are in a lower elevation Wyoming sage system, you have, of course, greater distances between your individual species, you have lower biomass, and externally, you also have greater fluctuations in terms of precipitation among years. So you have lower precipitation, it's more variable, you have a lower abundance of your perennial herbaceous species. This provides increased opportunities for invasion by species like cheatgrass. When you decrease the opportunity for those fluctuations, both by increasing plant biomass and decreasing the yearly fluctuations of precipitation, you start to be able to more effectively exclude those species.